Welcome to the lecture on request response pattern. So in this lecture, we will do the same thing that we have done previously. We will try to understand request response pattern, and then we'll also define one standard definition how to explain request response pattern. After that, I'll show you in a real world how a request response happens from a web browser to a server. After that, we will do a simple exercise of drawing our own request response pattern. Okay, so let's move on and understand the objective. So this is the objective of this lecture. First, we'll explain request response pattern. You should be able to define this in your own words. I'll give you a standard definition. If you remember it, if you understand the concept, you should be able to explain in your own words. Then you'll understand the concept with a real world example. I'll show you in how in a real world the request response happen from a client side to a server side. Then you should be able to draw a simple request response diagram based on whatever understanding that you have done. Okay, so let's move on and understand what is request response pattern. Let's take a step back and understand in real world how this request response happens. So imagine a scenario where you're trying to dial to your phone. First thing, you will pick up your phone and you'll dial the number and you'll call your friend. The friend will answer your phone and then you initiate the communication of talking to your friend. So this type of communication or pattern is called as synchronous communication, wherein you're calling your friend and your friend is answering your call. This is also called as two-way communication because it's a synchronous communication and the friend is also available talking to you at the same time. It's also called as two-way communication. Okay, so let's define with these concepts what is called as request response pattern. Okay, so let's define the same concept, synchronous communication and two-way communication in internet. At the client side, I have a browser. At web server, I have a server which have all the resource. So in the request response pattern, the first request is initiated by the client. The client will request to say, okay, I need these files. The web server will give a response saying that, okay, these are all the files that you requested, here it is. And this pattern is basically called as request response pattern. Well, here's a standard definition. In web environment, client, the browser, sends the request to the server, and server, which is nothing but a machine, gives a resource as a response. Okay, so this is how the two communication happen between two systems. One is called as client who's requesting, one is called as server who is responding to that request. Okay, so let's continue and see this example in the real world. Let's do a quick demo on understanding how the request response happen in a real world. So I have the two servers here. The left hand side is basically a client, the right hand side is a server. So let's understand how the request response happen via a web browser to a server. So on the right hand side, as I told you, I have a Tomcat server. This is a web server, and on this Tomcat server I have a folder called PHP training, and I have two resources. One is an HTML file and one is an image of a dog. So now the client want to access this resource on the server. Okay, so what happens is the request is initiated by the client. That's what we are saying. So the thing is, you need to know where this server is accessible, right? So there's an IP address. So I'll type in the IP address and then I will type in the folder name. And once the folder name, then I'll say I need index.html file. Okay, so when I click it, so the request will go to this server. Tomcat server will say, okay, you need these two files. The two files will be given back to the client, and the client will able to display that output. Okay, so we're going to see that. So when I click enter, okay, so you see there is some text and there is an image here. This is basically coming up from this server. So this server is web server, this is a client, and if you have to see more in detail, you zoom this. Okay, so that way is basically showing you how the request response happen from client to server. Okay, so if you don't have access to the server, obviously if you're trying to access yahoo.com, you don't know what's happening at Yahoo. But from the browser, you can even check this transaction, how the request response is happening from the browser. For that, right click on the web page, say inspect, then you'll go to network tab. Okay, refresh the page. So when you refresh the page, you should be able to see the index.html and dog1.jpg. And if you click on the page, you should see something interesting happening here. there's basically a request header and a response header, and you see there's a request that has been sent to this file, and then there is a response that is coming up from the server. So you see there's a request response happening from the client to the server. So if I refresh and click this again, you should see there's a request response keep happening between the two servers. So this is the pattern that I want you to remember, that there is a request that has been sent from the client side to the server side, and server side will give you a response of whatever resources that we are asking for. This is very important to understand how PHP works. So when we try to bring all these concepts together, then you'll see how the PHP application is used in the web-based applications. Okay, so let's go back and draw a simple diagram of how a request response works. Okay, so that was a simple example and a real world example of how request response works. Next, let's do a simple exercise. I want you to draw a simple request and response pattern on a paper. This way, whatever understanding that you have, you will come to know whether it's correct or it's wrong. So I highly recommend you do this exercise, show how to draw a request response pattern. Okay, so you can pause this video, then come back here and again play this video. So how did it go? Did you manage to draw the simple request and response pattern? So here is a simple request response pattern looks like. You have a web browser. Web browser is sending a request to the web server, and web server is basically having an HTML file. That's what we have seen. The HTML file is given back to the web browser by the web server, which is called as response. So don't forget the definition. If someone asks you what is a request response pattern, give this definition to them. A web browser sends the request to the web server to access the HTML page, and web server sends the HTML page to the web browser as a response. Okay, this is a standard definition. If you're going to an interview, or you're going to write a written test, or you're going to explain this to someone else, please use this definition and help them understand, to show how you understand this concept very well. Okay, so let's move on. So here's a summary of request response pattern. By now you should be able to explain request response pattern. You will be able to understand the concept with real world example. Whatever exercise we have done, you can even go ahead and do that on the Chrome by accessing a web application. You should be now able to draw a simple request response diagram. Okay, so that's all for this lecture. I'll see you in the next one.